So we're going to be starting off on Chapter 2, which is Nutrition Tools, Standards, and Guidelines. I always think of this chapter as being the one that is a bit of an alphabet soup of nutrition, if you will. And I want to give you, I'm not going to go through all the information that's in your textbook. You can read through that and then go through some of the tools in Canvas to get you to help you to learn what's going on here. But I do want to give you a little background in terms of why this is important and why we've actually started doing or why we have actually some nutrition guidelines. And I don't know if you can hear my background music here and are wondering why the heck I'm playing the Pirates of the Caribbean song for you, but hopefully it'll be clear here in just a second. So let's progress on in this one. So perhaps why I was playing that song is coming to you now. If you go back to the early 1800s, it's a time where we really started moving away from looking at our diet or being able to decide what to eat based on our culture and or our group and our family in terms of where we lived. We started traveling. We went abroad. And so as people started to get away from their traditional ways of eating, they started having some issues. So you've probably heard the term scurvy pirate. And what they found is they got on these sailing ships and they didn't have fresh produce. They started having some symptoms of what we now know were vitamin deficiencies and vitamin C deficiency in particular that caused scurvy. So when we go to look at what happened here in Britain, so the Merchant Seamen's Act of 1835, this really was the first time where government actually assumed the responsibility of protecting its people through putting in a law, really, that you had to have fresh lemons on the ships in order to prevent this from happening. So this is kind of where we see the start of nutrition recommendations being governed by legislative bodies. And how do we determine some of these? So as we kind of cruise through and we look at either depressions and or wartime, this is often where we had some advances in nutrition. So during the economic depression of 1862, Dr. Edward Smith was charged with finding out how many calories do we actually need to make sure that our population is not starving. So they wanted to come up with how do we determine this and what can we give them to make sure that they're not starving. And I'm going to take you on an aside here. I will go ahead and post on Canvas. You'll have on there a description of what happens and how what happens to calories as we burn them and where do they go, because I think it's interesting and it's a great fact to be able to carry on from this class. But some of you may already know this, but I want you to think about this. So when you lose weight, so you burn calories, and you actually lose mass. So if you were somebody who lost, say, 15 pounds, lost 15 pounds of fat, where exactly does that fat go? Where does it transfer to? And I'll tell you, as I ask this question, and I can ask this of a variety of groups of people. I've done this with physicians, I've asked nurses, and I oftentimes will ask my college students, and probably what's coming to your mind is it goes to muscle, is what I've heard some people say, which unfortunately fat doesn't ever turn into muscle. Or you lose it through your urine or you lose it through your feces. But as you probably see here on the slide, where fat goes is you actually exhale it. So you burn off that fat, and the basic components of that fat are excreted from your body and CO2. So that's the waste product of the breakdown of fat. So basically you breathe it out. And so early on, this is something that they would do to determine how many calories were required. So you have here the instrument they were using to determine how much CO2 production he was using doing exercise. So this is how Dr. Edward Smith was looking at measurements of how many calories. So how many calories do you think were required? What do you think that was determined to prevent starvation in the 1800s? I'll give you a minute to kind of think about that. Most students are surprised to find his study showed that about 2,800 calories and about 80 grams of protein were required to prevent starvation. And again, remember late 1800s, people were a lot more physically active. I mean, just their daily lives were a lot more physical than what we have today. So the requirements were a little higher. And that may be an overestimate of what perhaps actually they needed to prevent starvation. That's probably what they needed to maintain their current. So we go on into World War I. Again, a lot of research was done here regarding calorie intake to make our soldiers a little bit more efficient. Found that about 70 to 80 grams of protein per day and about 3,000 calories, and a little bit less for women. So during these times we had food rationing going on back at home or here in England so that they could support their soldiers while they're in war. So a lot of look in terms of calories, carbohydrates, proteins, fats during this time. As I alluded to in the beginning, we started looking at foods were protective in some way. They didn't really know that it was vitamin C in these lemons that were preventing the scurvy. So we knew about the energy nutrients, protein, carbs, and fat. But we started seeing, as again we were industrializing and moving away from our traditional ways of eating, that there were some protective factors in food. So early 1900s, we started seeing in our country, a lot of nutrient deficiencies. We didn't know there were nutrient deficiencies, but we had a lot of symptoms that we couldn't put our finger on. We found that certain foods tended to prevent that. So as you're thinking about this, what food should I eat, and how do I know if my diet's adequate? How do I know if I'm getting all my vitamins and minerals? A lot of this information is coming from these earlier studies. So probably one of the most famous individuals, one of the famous nutrition researchers out there was Wilbur Atwater. And the Atwater values are actually what we look at in terms of how many calories there are per gram of protein, how many calories per gram of fat, and how many calories per gram of carbohydrate. So he's the one that did the early research looking at, that we have 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate or 4 calories per gram of protein and 9 calories per gram of fat. He did all that research that was looking at these different foods and determining the caloric value of that. I put this little quote up here because I find this kind of interesting. Basically, he was commenting back in 1900 that unless care is exercised in selecting food, a diet may result, which is one-sided or badly balanced. That is, one in which fat or fuel ingredients, carbohydrate and fat, are provided in excess. And the evils of overeating may not be felt at once, but sooner or later they are sure to appear, perhaps in an excessive amount of fatty tissue, perhaps in general debility, perhaps an actual disease. And again, this is Atwater back in 1902. We didn't have obesity rates. I don't think we had hardly any obesity rates back there. So it's kind of fascinating that even at that point, he was appreciating the fact that if we're not really paying attention to nutrition, we can have some issues. So you'll be reading a lot about the recommended dietary intakes, or what were originally the recommended dietary allowances. And some of the early research, again, was based on a lot of these deficiencies that we were seeing in families, children, and adults. And some of that research came out of this Hazel Stengel, who is amazing to me that she had a PhD in chemistry. She was born in 1896. We just didn't see women going to college back in that day, so to actually have a PhD in chemistry is pretty impressive. And so she was doing some information looking at basal metabolism. She was looking at the nutritional value of protein in humans and looking at some of the studies in terms of vitamins and how that was impacting overall health. She was selected to be the head of the food economics and the food and nutrition division of the Bureau. So she was ultimately, that became the USDA. So she was sort of the first head into this because of some of the research and some of her findings. And one of the things she was really looking at was how to design diets that would prevent pellagra. So during this time, and I've got just a clip here of what pellagra actually looked like. It was a vitamin B deficiency, these horrible rashes, dermatitis on their skin, this inflammation on their tongue, all the way up to death. So it was a terrible disease that was fairly rampant actually in the early 1900s. So Hazel Stengel was tasked with this. How do we help them? How do we educate this population? Because we didn't have vitamin B pills to give out at that time. That hadn't come about yet. And so she had to give guidelines to these families in terms of what they needed to eat. Well, we also didn't have at that time any sort of lists of food that had the vitamin content. So when you look at why do we have these lists today, and we have all of these foods broken down into the different vitamins and minerals, this is kind of where it started. We needed to have a way to educate people and provide them information to find out what they needed to add to their diet to prevent that disease from happening. So she came up with these guidelines. Her first publication was a set of dietary allowances, basically in 1933, And this very early guideline was specific to certain vitamins and minerals. It was specific to the information that was out there at the time. Ultimately, it was expanded to include, we knew that different age groups needed different requirements in terms of vitamins and minerals, as you'll see today when you're looking at your recommended dietary intakes and you're reading through this chapter. It's based on different age groups, pregnant, not pregnant, male, female, and whatnot. And her early ones were actually established to allow about 50% above the minimum average. So, and also very focused on healthy people. So as you're going through and looking at this, the set of guidelines that you have in your book are specific to healthy individuals. If somebody's sick, there's different guidelines that would be there for them. So ultimately, from her early work, we lead on to Lydia Roberts, who became the chair of the National Research Council's Committee on Food and Nutrition. And this committee ultimately came about and put out what was the first set of what we call the recommended dietary allowances. And that was in 1941. So they had the first set of what are the vitamins that you need, how much of those do you need, and then the specific foods that would meet those needs. And all of these were set initially to really prevent diseases. Ultimately, what we have today, as you're looking at as you're reading through this, we'll have levels which we call the tolerable upper intake levels, because if a little bit's good, a lot's better in a lot of people's eyes. And so people have tended to now be taking too many vitamins and minerals. So we've kind of shifted from preventing the disease, moved on now into preventing people from overdosing on disease. And as we move along, the other thing that you'll see is we not only have specific values for specific vitamins and minerals, but there's also some guidelines in terms of what types of foods should we put together. So this was some of that early National Research Council Committee on Food and Nutrition. These were some of the early guidelines in terms of putting food into groups and trying to group them into categories that would somewhat make sense. So you can see here you've got the bodybuilding foods, which would be over here in group 1, which are going to be some of your more protein-based foods. The energy foods, so foods that would give you a lot more calories and would give you energy, would be a little longer lasting. And then over here into the protective foods, which is kind of interesting. Back in the day, we saw a lot of rickets, which is why you're seeing milk and butter and cheese, which are very high in vitamin D. Liver, which is very high in vitamin D. On over into some of your whole grains and fruits and vegetables over here. So the recommendation was to eat something from each group every day. But as you look at these early food charts, kind of interesting to see where we're at today. So this is sort of where we started. These were protective foods, and we've moved on into where we are today. So I hope you enjoy kind of reading through and looking at some of the alphabet soup. Sometimes these introductory chapters, these first couple of weeks, it's a lot of just background information in terms of why nutrition science is where it's at, and where you can go to find some of the specifics on nutrition. So